In this lesson, we will learn how to factor four terms. So let's look at our first example. AX, BX, AY, BY, there you go, these are my four terms. So in order to do or to factor something like that, I have to group the first two terms together and group the next two terms together. So that would be my first step. Then I need to look at my first group. Is there anything in common between those two terms? AX and BX. There's an X in common, so I factor the GCF X. Now, if I factor X out of AX, I get an A. If I factor X out of BX, I get a B. So I just factored X out. Now, how can I factor, or how can I find the GCF for these two? What's in common? The Y. So factor the Y out. If you take Y out of the AY, you will be A will remain, and then you copy down the positive, factor the BY out of the Y out of the BY, and you will get a B. Now, so the first step is to group them. The second step is to find the GCF between the two terms and factor it out. Now, the last step is to check whatever's inside the parentheses. Is it exactly the same thing? A plus B, A plus B. So that is going to be one of your factors. The second factor is going to be the GCF that you factored out, which is X plus Y, and that would be your second factor. So you can write it like that, or you can write it as A plus B, and then X plus Y. So that's how you factor four terms. So let's look at this example. Do I have four terms? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. So now I have to group the first two together and the next two together. So A to the power 3 minus 4A to the power 2. Now, what about the next two terms? 3A minus 12. Let's group them together. So the first step is done. Now the second step is to look at the terms inside the parentheses. Is there anything in common? Now this has an A to the power 3, this has an A to the power 2. So remember what we said, we always factor the variable having the least power, which is A squared in this case. So A cubed means I have an A, and another A. If I factor A2 out of them, then I will only have an A left. If I factor A squared out of the negative 4A squared, that will give me a negative 4. So I factored the GCF out. Now let's look at the next group. 3A minus 12. What's common between them? 3 and 12 are both divisible by 3, so 3 is in common. Now, 3 divided by 3 is a 1, so that's 1A. And then don't forget to copy down the minus. 12 divided by 3 is a 4, so that would give you a negative 4. Now let's look at what I have inside the parentheses, A minus 4 and A minus 4. That would be my first factor. My second factor is whatever I have on the outside, the GCF. So that would be A squared plus 3. And there you go, I have just factored four terms. Now let's move on to number 1. I'm going to give you some time to try number 1 on your own. Please pause the video. Now I hope you tried on your own, so let's start working on factoring those four terms. So let's look at the first two. What do I have in common? I can see that this is X to the power 2 and this has an X, so I take X out. If I factor X out of the X to the power 2, I'll be left with an X plus factor the X out of the 3XY, and I will be left with 3Y. Always distribute to check your work. X times X to the power 2, that's X to the power 2. X times 3Y, that's 3XY. Now let's move on to the next group. 2 and 6, so there's a 2 in common, plus 2. Now I see that there is an X here, but no X here, so there's no X in common. Y and Y squared, so I have a Y in common. If I factor 2y out of the 2xy, x is going to be left, plus 6 divided by 2 is a 3, and I factored a y out of the y squared, so only y will be left. Now check inside the parentheses, exactly the same. So that would be my first factor, and my second factor is whatever the GCF is, which is x plus 2y. Now please pause the video again and try the next one on your own. Now unfortunately you cannot really plug this in the calculator and check your work, so the only way to check your work is to actually distribute and FOIL. Now I hope you tried on your own. If you haven't, please pause the video and try number 2. Now let's try together. Let's group the first 2 and the last 2. So what's common between 6a cubed and negative 9a squared b? Now 6 and 9 are both divisible by 3. Now a cubed, a squared, I always take the one with the least power, but there's no b in common. So if you factor 6 divided by 3, that's a 2. So you see how I'm dividing it and taking one at a time. A cubed, I factored a squared out, so there's only an a left. Minus, so let's copy the minus. 9 divided by 3, that's a 3. I factored the a squared out, so it's gone. Now b, I didn't touch it, so I have to have a b next to the 3. Now let's move on to the next term. So we have a plus. Now, what's in common between the 4 and the 6? That's a 2. Now this one has an a, but this one does not, so there's no a in common. This has a b, this have a b squared. So b1 is the least power, so I have a b in common. Now 4 divided by 2, that's a 2. I didn't touch the a, so copy it. I factored out the b, so the b is gone. So check, 2b times 2a is 4ab. Copy down the minus. 6 divided by 2, that's a 3. I have a b squared, and I factor 1b out, so that's a b left. Now check inside the parentheses, they are exactly the same. So 2a minus 3b is going to be my first factor, and 3a squared plus 2b is going to be my second factor. Now that's the end of our lesson for today. Make sure that you practice and check Canvas for the key.